description. Okay, I'm going to assume that we all agree with this famous funeral inscription from Rome, stating that bath, together with wine and sex, are among the pleasures that, wit and facient, make life worth living. The centrality of this practice continued into the later centuries of the Roman Empire, and public baths remain important landmarks of Byzantine cities and towns. In fact, the traditional privatization theory, assuming a decline of public baths in late antiquity in favor of private facilities, has been disproved by a recent reassessment of the archaeological and literary evidence. Scholars like Sadi Marechal, author of an important study on baths in late antique Italy, North Africa, and Palestine, have reconstructed the evolution of these buildings, highlighting differences in architecture, decoration, and technology. One of the main trends identified by Marechal is the lack of newly built imperial-type bathhouses after the early 4th century, and these were large buildings with a symmetrical monumental plan. In contrast, he emphasizes the prevalence of small facilities like the so-called Schola bath in Leptis Magna, shown here. Usually, these structures have an area of less than 500 square meters, and to give you a comparison, the nearby Bath of Hadrian cover approximately 5,000 square meters. Most of the work on later baths has focused on the provinces surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, with few studies addressing the development of public bath and bathing in the late Roman West. The role played by a rural bath during this period has received even less attention. The paper aims to partially fill this gap, bringing into the spotlight the nuanced sociocultural functions of later rural bath in one of the most remote provinces of the empire, Britannia. Research on these buildings remains scattered among several different publications and unpublished reports. Probably because of this, while scholars produce detailed excavation reports of specific bathhouses, fewer have tried to look at the broader picture. I will focus on a precise geographical and chronological context, Southeast England and Gloucestershire between the late 3rd and early 5th century CE. And this is the distribution of villas in the southeast across the Roman period. This region includes 4 modern counties: Kent, Surrey, West, and East Sussex. And this is Gloucestershire in southwest England, again with the distribution of villas and settlement across the Roman period. The choice of this case study area is dictated by the intensive level of excavation compared to other parts of the country and by the different patterns that emerge from a diachronic study of the rural sites in these 2 regions. In fact, the southeast saw the highest number of rural sites during the first 3 centuries of the Roman occupation, peaking during the 2nd century and showing a decline during the 3rd and especially 4th centuries. Gloucestershire presents an opposite pattern with an increase in the number of sites from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, where the number of villas reached its highest, a marker of the region's general prosperity in late antiquity. The reasons for this discrepancy are not entirely clear. Some scholars have linked it with the significant political and administrative changes occurring in Roman Britain in late antiquity. The province was divided into Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior during the early 3rd century, and then further subdivided into 4 provinces almost a century later as part of the reorganization promoted by Diocletian. The rural settlement of Roman Britain project has indeed identified some patterns that suggest an east-west split during the 3rd and 4th centuries, including a slightly greater emphasis on 3rd century settlement abandonment in the east and establishment in the west. The project conferred a major increase in late Roman villa construction in parts of the west, like Gloucestershire. There was also a slight shift in the concentration of corn dryers to parts of the southwest during the 4th century, suggesting an expansion of the arable land that constituted the economic base of villas. However, it remains uncertain if these late Roman patterns do relate in any way to the changes in provincial administration. There is also some evidence that the political instability of the mid-4th centuries had consequences on the prosperity of the southeast. Stephen Koch has recently reconsidered two events recorded in Ammianus Marcellinus' Res Gestae that might have affected high-status sites in the southeast during this period. The first involved the reprisal taken by a certain Paulus Catena, an agent of Constantius II, against British supporters of Magnentius after the Civil War of 350-353. The passage in question mentioned that Paulus, quote, went far beyond his instruction and descending like a sudden torrent upon the person and estates of many people, spread ruin and destruction in various forms. It is unclear, however, how this might have impacted the southeast more than anywhere else in the province. The other event discussed by Koch is the so-called barbarian conspiracy of 367 CE. The scale of this episode is disputed, and we are not even sure about its precise nature. It was perhaps an incursion of Franks and Saxons, even though Ammianus mentioned only their attacks on Gaul. Or alternatively, there might have been a mutiny among the Roman troops or some other kind of civil unrest in London. In any case, Theodosius the Elder was sent to Britain by Emperor Valentinian to restore order. In this case, we know that the troubles affected the area between Richborough and London, that is, North Kent. Even allowing for a certain amount of hyperbole, Ammianus' words suggest that the roving parties of freebooters, whoever they were, had accumulated a considerable amount of loot at the expense of, quote, the wretched provincials. Gloucestershire and the rest of the southwest England were not as affected by these struggles and might have benefited from a less oppressive military presence. On the other hand, while the number of settlements was reducing in the southeast, many villas continued to be occupied into the 4th century. The important site of Bignor in West Sussex received significant levels of investment during this period, and we'll discuss it in more detail later. Moreover, as you can see in this map, several villas cluster in the Darent and Midway valleys in North Kent, so over here, like Eccles, were only abandoned in the late 4th century. As noted by Martin Allen, the decline of rural settlements perhaps reflected developments in land use and economic reorganization, implying an intensification of agricultural production in the 4th century. In any case, in the southeast, not only 9 new rural baths date to the 4th century, all of which were built before 350 CE. Except for a couple of examples, these new baths were compact and simply decorated, implying a general reduction of the resources invested by the owners in these amenities. Urban and military contexts show even less initiative in this sense. The baths at the military bases of the so-called Saxon shore were kept in operation during this period, and some earlier structures like the public bath of Canterbury and Chichester were restored. However, the public baths at Canterbury were abandoned in around 350 CE. Another smaller bathhouse there, possibly a privately owned establishment open to the public, was enlarged in about 360, but soon after destroyed by a fire and never rebuilt. The only urban bathhouse constructed in the southeast during the 4th century is a set of private facilities built in Canterbury in about 310. As you can see from this map, the building was located south of the public bath and might have functioned as a smaller and perhaps well-appointed alternative to the public facilities. It was refurbished in about 350 and dismantled only at the end of the 4th century. Gloucestershire, on the other hand, offers a very different picture. 7 out of the 14 villa baths dating to the 4th century come from this county alone, and their number must have been even higher if we consider the tremendous impact that 18th and 19th century excavation had on our understanding of site chronologies in this region. In fact, we should add at least 2 other sites to the list. As I've mentioned, many villas in Gloucestershire reached their peak during the 4th century and were embellished with elaborate mosaics. The investment in new baths, often large and richly decorated, confirms a positive trend that continues into the second half of the century. A similar trend can also be identified as Cirencester, by then possibly the provincial capital of Britannia Prima. Unfortunately, the location of the public bath of Cirencester is unknown, and those at Gloucester, the other major town in the region, are poorly understood. However, private facilities dating to the 4th century have been identified as Cirencester. And if Cirencester was indeed the capital, this could explain the uninterrupted investment into the city during the 4th century. Part of the new privileged class, attracted by similar centers of power, was formed of military men and members of the enlarged imperial bureaucracy. These groups of newcomers might have initiated a wave of private building in the town and its surroundings. In turn, this might have triggered a new form of elite competition between them, the old aristocracy, and low-level provincial senators. After all, Bowes notes how Diocletian's reform and Constantine's expansion of the senatorial order produced, quote, a bewildering variety of aristocracies. Furthermore, the emergence of more specialized economies in the Cotswold, a region north of Cirencester, including wool production and cattle and sheep farming, may account for the rural vitality of this region during the 4th century. After this brief overview of the two regions, I will focus on the sociocultural implication of this late antique bath and the different trends observed in Gloucestershire and southeast England. The architecture and decoration of private residences in the late Roman period have been traditionally seen as mirroring an increasingly hierarchical society. Kim Bowes has convincingly challenged this view, arguing that these houses, with their elaborate dining rooms and refined mosaics, were instead machines for competition. By this, she means that they continue to be, quote, part of a conversation, a competitive discourse between neighboring owners, like the one we usually attribute to late Republican and early imperial domus in Italy, end quote. Similarly, Sadi Morehal has interpreted the construction of semi-public baths attached to urban and rural residences in late antique North Africa as an attempt to speed up the process of social advancement by reinforcing the links between wealthy patrons and their local communities. This somehow questioned the idea of an elite that was increasingly isolated from their inferiors at this time. As we have seen, the progressive abandonment of the main public bath in Canterbury during the 4th century was counterbalanced by the construction of privately owned establishments, similar to the North African bath discussed by Morehal. We can speculate a similar context as Cirencester, where many late private baths have been identified. In the rest of this paper, I will try to demonstrate that this phenomenon spread into the countryside. Indeed, I think that some of the largest facilities built on the premises of villas might have functioned as rural public baths, perhaps sponsored by wealthy landowners. Discussing 4th century villas in Britain, Sarah Scott has stressed the prominent role of these complexes in the landscape. In her view, they, quote, dominate the social, economic, and religious life of those living and working in the vicinity, end quote. And given the size of some of these villas, the number of people dependent on the owners of these residences might have been substantial. Scholars accept that these patrons were keen to maintain and sponsor the religious structures often associated with their estates as a source of social status. I suggest that the provision of rural public baths will have been another effective way to enhance their influence over their local communities. I will now assess the evidence from some key sites to identify structural elements in support of this hypothesis. I will focus on Bucks Farm in Kent, Bignor in West Sussex, and Great Wycombe and Chedworth in Gloucestershire. The octagonal bathhouse at Bucks Farm was built in the early 4th century and was part of a compound of buildings not yet excavated. During this period, octagonal rooms became popular in Britain, and buildings with this plan in other counties have been interpreted as baths, baptistries, or grand reception rooms. The building at Bucks Farm certainly worked as a bathhouse, although a later conversion to Christian use, cannot be excluded. The central pool might point in that direction, and the discovery of this lead seal, seemingly depicting a Jewish menorah, complicate things further. In any case, this was a large and lavishly decorated structure with mosaic floors, wall paintings, and imported marble. While not yet excavated, one of the structures nearby was large enough to be the main residential building. The complex probably had river access to the Swale estuary via a small harbour. It was also connected by a paved road to Watling Street, the main road linking Dover to London. Since we know little about the rest of the complex, it is difficult to prove that these facilities might have functions as rural public baths, but the building size and strategic location seems to point in that direction. Bigner, our second case study, offers more evidence in this respect, and this is one of the few complexes in the southeast that underwent a substantial upgrade in the late 3rd, early 4th centuries. A late 2nd century timber structure was transformed in the mid-3rd century into a small masonry building of corridor type. The structure evolved into a winged corridor villa during the second half of the century, and in about 300 CE, the house was extended eastward to incorporate northern and southern ranges of rooms and was equipped with 2 sets of baths, which are shown here. During the 4th century, the complex was further enlarged to become one of the most elaborate courtyard villas in the region, decorated with high-quality mosaic floors. And this is, as I say, the villa at the beginning of the 4th century with the 2 bathhouses highlighted in yellow. The duplication of bath is a well-attested phenomenon across the empire. In Britain, we have several examples, especially during the late 1st and early 2nd century. For instance, this is the villa at Abbey Farm in Kent, where at the beginning of the 2nd century, 2 bathhouses were built, one immediately to the west of the main house, which is building 3 over here, and one outside the villa enclosure, building 6A over here. The excavator suggested the latter was intended for the use of the state workers, quote, was presence within the villa owner's private walled compound was not acceptable. And this might be true, but the mere fact that the owner invested such a great deal of money in the construction of facilities for the well-being of his workers is significant, especially since building 6A, as you can see, is almost double the size of building 3. And we have textual evidence reinforcing this explanation. In his De Re Rustica, Columella includes rustica balnea, bath for the country folk, among the important components of the pars rustica of a villa state. Remarkably, he also advises that they bathe only on holidays, for the frequent use of bath is not conducive to physical vigor. So coming back to Bigner, the context is similar and different at the same time. We have 2 sets of baths, and even though in this case the smaller baths were apparently left unfinished, they were likely planned to become the private bath for the owner and his family. The implication is that the large south wing bath, richly decorated and modified 3 times in less than a century, were perhaps open to a broader set of people. However, the idea that these luxurious baths were built exclusively for the country folk seems unlikely. Instead, I suggest that they function as social hubs for the communities living in the surroundings of the villa, reinforcing the prestige and influence of the owner. The fact that these baths were located at the end of one of the wings of the villa and were more easily accessible from the courtyard than from the residential area of the complex seems to suggest a wider clientele. Alternatively, these facilities might have been shared by the 3 distinct households identified by Black in his reassessment of the villa during the 4th century. And this is the plan of the final phase of the complex. We find a similar arrangement at Grey Wycombe in Gloucestershire. The villa was originally built as a winged corridor house in the 2nd or early 3rd centuries and transformed into a courtyard villa in the early 4th century. As you can see, it was equipped with 2 sets of baths in its west wing. The one in the southwest range, originally detached, was incorporated into the main body of the building in the 4th century and significantly enlarged. It was decorated with wall paintings and mosaics, like this wonderful marine scene from room 6. Sorry, I went something. This, this wonderful marine scene from room 6, the frigidarium of the bath. Significantly, as you can see from the plan, this beautiful set of baths could have been accessed only via the villa's south courtyard. So this is the only entrance to the bath. Moreover, Great Wycombe is remarkable for a series of religious features. The waterscape surrounding the site is very complex, with one spring sited just above the villa, one near a possible temple, 80 meters to the southwest, and one about 50 meters to the southeast, at the foot of the scarp into which the villa complex was built. The spring head of the stream flowing south of the site is almost about 250 meters to the southwest of the complex. The springs located above the complex had an important ritual function and fed a series of water features identified within the complex itself. There was probably a cantharus fountain in the large octagonal room 15, which you see here on the plan. So this is room 15. It was probably a tower, or at least this has been the most recent interpretation of it. And this cantharus fountain occupied the prime axial position behind the main gallery in the central range of the villa. The drain beneath the floor of this room led to a hollow box-like chamber, a semi-subterranean pool located in front of the villa's portico that you can see here on the right. The feature was accessed via a narrow portal and a short flight of steps. The springs also fed a water cistern found in the center of room 1. This elaborately decorated room, shown in this reconstruction, was partially underground and has been interpreted as a shrine. Significantly, the same water was used to supply the bath. This direct link between the sacred springs and the bath means that bathers interacted with a special kind of water that could not be found elsewhere, making this experience unique and memorable. In fact, the religious implication of physical contact with holy water should not be underestimated, especially in a context like Britain, where watery places held important cultic significance since the Iron Age. Considering the site's religious associations, Walters and Ryder have recently proposed that the complex was a source sanctuary dedicated to water healing deities. The octagonal water fountain in the central range of the complex and its associated semi-subterranean pool strongly suggest a ritual function. Moreover, Walters and Ryder's reconstruction of a problematic underpin structure in the lower portion of the east range as a broad flight of steps is convincing, and a similar feature will fit more a public than a private complex. So this is the feature I'm talking about. This is a very strange feature that has been, I just say, interpreted, I think, correctly as a flight of steps. Finally, the roof of the shrine, located between the 2 sets of baths, was decorated with at least 2 pierced panels with confronted S-shaped. And this likely functioned as acroterial decoration. You see here the one discovered in room 1, and there is the S shape over there, and you can also see the central pool. The central pool over here. There's a beautiful watercolor by Samuel Lyson, who excavated the site in the early 19th century. So these beautiful decorations, this S-shape decoration. Well, recently Anthony Beeson the note that this S-shaped motif was consistently associated with sacred buildings, whether temples, shrines, or gravestones, and its use reinforces the religious connotation of this part of the complex. My final case study is the large villa at Chedworth in Gloucestershire, which is also associated with several religious features. A major rebuilding in the late 3rd, early 4th centuries transformed the complex into a courtyard-type villa, and further modification occurred during the 4th century. In its final phase, the villa had an internal court and an external courtyard divided by a cross gallery with a gatehouse. So this is the upper courtyard, the cross gallery, and the lower courtyard. The first set of baths, the north bath, were built at some point during the 2nd or 3rd centuries and significantly enlarged during the late 3rd century renovation. A new set of lavishly decorated baths, the west bath, were added during the 4th century, while the north bath were reduced in size and perhaps converted to dry heat bath. This site was also part of an impressive religious landscape. A circular temple, number 3 on the map, over here, was identified about 150 meters east of the villa's entrance. A substantial stone temple with a square plan, number 4, here, was excavated less than a kilometer further east. And another structure referred to as the Capitol in the literature lay about 160 meters to the northwest of the villa, and is number 2 here. A recent reassessment of the site suggests that the Capitol was probably a tower-like building of pentagonal form. It had some kind of water feature as its center and might have functioned as a spring-lined temple near the villa's primary source of water supply. Moreover, several fragments of statues of deities and altars were found at the villa and in its surroundings. These include at least 2 depictions of Diana, a relief of a hunter god identified as Apollo Kunomaglos, a possible Genius Cucullatus, a finger of an over life-size bronze statue, and a series of miniature altars, some of which are shown here. So considering the site's religious association, the disposition of the 2 sets of baths can be interpreted as a sort of frame for the focal point of the inner courtyard, an infeum built during the 4th century over a former reservoir. This elegant apsidal structure contained an octagonal basin collecting the water from the sacred spring located near the Capitol. So the connection between bathing and some forms of religious practice taking place at the site is intriguing. Like at Great Wycombe, we have sacred springs, this time monumentalized by the Capitol and an infeum, which supply water to the bath. Once again, the owner will have been able to offer a unique experience to his guest, bathing in sacred water, perhaps believed to have healing properties. Might this bath have been accessible also to the peasantry visiting the shrine, perhaps during special occasions such as religious festivals? Well, the evidence is thin, but the unusual number of crudely carved miniature altars from the site might point to the presence of a religious focal point that attracted worshippers of lower status. Intriguingly, at some point the religious context at Chedworth might have changed. In fact, the Nymphaeum produced 3 of the few occurrences of the Kira symbol in 4th century Britain. They were incised into 3 of the stones from the edging of the Nymphaeum's basin, one of which is shown in this slide. As noted by Esmond clearly, the fact that this symbol was placed in such a visible position suggests that at some point during the 4th century, the Christian faith was practiced at the site. He also argues that the act of incising the kira might have been part of a ritual intended to cast out the demon presiding over the springs. After cleansing the shrine in this way, the waters might have acquired some further layer of meaning as the kira put them under the protection of the new god. One wonders about the consequences that this might have had for the bathers engaging with such water. Chedworth has also been recently reassessed by Walters and Ryder and identified once again as a sanctuary dedicated to water healing deities. While I remain more cautious about this interpretation, the number and quality of religious buildings surrounding the site, in conjunction with the several statues of deities discovered, is remarkable. Moreover, Walters and Ryder emphasize an architectural element that is particularly relevant to my discussion. So the stone forming the threshold between the frigidarium and the tepidarium of the west bath was found totally worn through at its center. And this is where the threshold was found. So considering that this building was in use for less than a century, the wear implies the tread of a large number of feet, conceivably too many to account for if the baths were used by only one family group. So let's assume for a moment that both Great Wycombe, shown here, and Chedworth were indeed water sanctuaries. In this case, the duplication of baths would have been dictated by the need to accommodate large number of pilgrims, as suggested by the massive bathhouse associated with the sanctuary of Mars Nodens at Linsney Park in Gloucestershire. The physical contact with sacred water and its potential healing properties was undoubtedly the principal appeal of these complexes. So the bathhouses provided the venue for these crucial encounters, and I will now briefly discuss the role of the senses in such process. Since religions were profoundly entangled with any healing process in antiquity, especially in connection with water, it is reasonable to assume that the ancient bathers were always aware that the physical benefit they were seeking had a divine origin. This religious connection was even more compelling when bathers interacted with water coming from sacred springs like at Great Wycombe and Chedworth. The strong cultic significance of watery places in Iron Age and Roman Britain certainly reinforced the intensity of such interactions. In pre-modern context, water can be conceptualized as universal and particular at the same time. From a religious point of view, this implies a categorization of different types of water with substantially different cosmological roles and importance. In the Roman world, spring water had certainly a prominent position in this categorization, as testified by Servius in his commentary on the Aeneid. Nullus enim fons non sacer, so there is no spring that is not sacred. To this general attitude, we should add the ritual emphasis on springs in the western half of the empire, reflected in the abundance of source sanctuaries in the Roman north, including Britain. So the spring's sensescape is vibrant, and these natural features fit nicely within the category of multitemporal and affect-generating sensorial assemblages proposed by Hamilakis, who sees a strong connection between the senses, memories, feelings, objects, and places. For instance, the sound of water gushing from the earth produces a lulling, repetitive sound with a quasi-hypnotic quality. Alongside the water's distinct smell and taste, this unique voice could have contributed to creating a site-specific religious sensory knowledge, where the worshipper's memories and sensorial experiences were intrinsically connected with the perceived agency of the numen. While any kind of interaction with this complex spring assemblage entails a significant sensory impact on the worshipper, the overwhelming body experience of bathing in such water had the potential of granting some form of communion with the gods. whether they were part of sanctuaries or not. The bathhouses at Great Wycombe and Chedworth, alongside the shrines, fountains, and wells, can therefore be considered part of the sacred springs sensorial assemblage. In a way, these buildings acted as a man-made amplifications of the spring's distinctive sensory characteristics, as their appearance, sound, smell, and taste were all made accessible inside these complexes. Yet, in comparison to the natural spring, these built spaces provided a further degree of sensory interaction with the divine, physical contact with sacred water through bathing. As I've tried to demonstrate today, the sociocultural changes that characterized late Roman Britain had complex and nuanced implications on the construction and use of baths. The province showed signs of an east-west divide in late antiquity, a phenomenon reflected in this paper 2 case study areas. In fact, the southeast saw a decline in the number of rural sites, as we have seen, and this somehow shrinking landscape suggests a possible concentration of power in the hands of few landowners. This dynamic might have influenced the construction of sophisticated baths at a limited number of particularly wealthy sites. In contrast to this checkered picture, Gloucestershire, with its new wave of private buildings, offers a display of prosperity and power. While the reason for this contrasting trend remained partially unclear, it is striking that wherever economic means were available in Gloucestershire as well as in the southeast, the investment in the construction and decoration of baths remained a natural choice for villa owners. Sometimes 2 bathhouses were in operation at the same time, usually with a set built in the inner quarters of the house and another accessible from a courtyard. Some of these baths might have been significant components of the machine for competition described by Bowes in a reassessment of late antique houses, granting prestige and influence over rural communities in a context of fierce rivalry between peers. By opening their baths to the people living and working in their estates, landowners showcase their power and secure supporters. In some instances, baths might have even functioned as catalysts for discrepant and new sociocultural values and even religious practices, as suggested by the seal depicting a menorah from Buck's Farm and the Kyros from Chedworth. The religious element was particularly significant at sites like Great Wycombe and Chedworth, where the owners will have offered a unique experience of bathing in water supplied by a sacred spring, providing at the same time a social and religious space to those living in the surroundings of the villa. The importance of such interaction might have been more prominent than previously recognized, with recent reassessments suggesting that both sites were source sanctuaries. Whether we accept this new interpretation or not, we should not underestimate the religious significance of water even in the apparently mundane space of the bath. The health benefits associated with bathing in antiquity were entangled with religious concerns, and bathers were always aware of the origin and unique qualities of the water they were interacting with. Thus, bathing in water from a sacred spring will have certainly been an extraordinary experience with powerful sensory implication. Indeed, the bathhouses at Great Wycombe and Chedworth, alongside the several water features they display, could be considered extension of the sacred spring sensorial assemblages, amplifying their distinctive sensory characteristics. In late antiquity, villa owners might have therefore used their rural bath to reinforce social hierarchies and cultural norms, shaping individual perceptions and interactions. The members of the rural population entering these spaces were thus subtly reminded of their place within the social order and encouraged to conform to the expectation of their community. On the other hand, religious concern could have affected the perceived social function of the bath, transforming them into spaces of divergent sensory experiences. Rural baths thus continue to be crucial built environments where identities were adjusted and negotiated. They function as microcosm of broader societal dynamics, where the interplay of sensory experiences and social interaction reflected the changing cultural fabric of late antiquity. Thank you.